This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order some Duskmourn cards, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We are now taking a look at Duskmourn Limited. Last week I talked about some early takeaways about the format before we had like a critical mass of data to really evaluate individual cards I was wrong about in the set review. But now we do have that critical mass of data, and as usual, I'm going to talk in this video about 10 cards that I got wrong. I'm going to discuss why I was wrong about them, where I went wrong, how the card works in the format, stuff like that. I always think this is a good way to sort of look at how the format's going, how it's shaking out, while also pointing out, card evaluation isn't perfect. It never is before you play a format. It's always impossible to know exactly how things will go. Alright, so let's start with a card that I alluded to, or more than alluded to. I named it last week because I was already pretty sure I had it wrong, and now we have enough data for me to say I did, and that is Unable to Scream. So, I give this a D in the set review. That's a grade I often give to removal that you run in an emergency, like, what I thought this would be, but that isn't very good overall. But it's been much better than a D. It's put up a 57.9% game-in-hand win rate. And by the way, the analytics I'm using in this video all come from 17 Lands. You can go to 17lands.com. Check out all the data they have about Limited on Arena. You can sign up to have your own data track too. That's where this comes from. So it's putting up a 57.9% win rate, like I said. And that's like a C+ level card. And I think there are some decks where it performs even better than that. So where did I go wrong here? Why is this better than, like, Witness Protection, right? We've seen cards like Witness Protection and Frogify, and we've seen all these things, and they've all been bad. Usually, like, F-level bad. I mean, I did say in the set review this is going to be better than most of the time because of Eerie, and I was right about that, but that's not the only reason it's better. So, the first thing, I mean, yes, Eerie is part of it. This is a one-mana way to trigger Eerie. It's much easier to feel like you get a full card worth of value when you cast Unable to Scream, because it's pretty likely you have some Eerie triggers. That is a relevant factor, but I think the card itself is also actually substantially better than something like Witness Protection was. Why is that? Well, I think a 0-2 is just way worse than a 1-1. I didn't think about that in the set review. To me, it was sort of like, this is removal that doesn't fully remove a creature because it can still block. And that's still true. But when a creature's a 1-1, like your X1s still can't really attack into it. It can team up and add power to blocks. It is going to be able to attack and block more effectively in most ways if it's a 1-1. A 0-2 can't really block. Well, it can block, but it can't really attack. It doesn't even block that well because it doesn't do damage. So I think a 0-2 with no abilities is way worse than a 1-1 with no abilities. That's not something I foresaw playing out, obviously, since I gave this a D. But that's how it's felt. I do think another factor is that +1/+1 counters aren't a huge theme in this format. That often makes a card like this a lot worse, where you're like, I guess I'll put Witness Protection on it, but it has 2 counters, right? So that doesn't feel great. But this format doesn't have that situation that much. It does happen sometimes. You go up against the 1-mana 1-1 that puts a +1/+1 counter on stuff when you have an enchantment enter. They've got counters on all their stuff, and you can put Unable to Scream on it, and that does feel pretty bad. But it doesn't happen that often, and that's just not something you end up having to worry about that much. So Unable to Scream, I think, is just an inherently better card. I think it just turns out that making the thing a 0-2 with no abilities, better than I expected, and then you throw in the Eerie angle being even more important than I expected it to be. So yeah, definitely not a D. It's a C+, and I think in decks with lots of Eerie, it probably goes even higher. So there are a lot of blue cards on this list. I think I got a lot of really important blue cards wrong, and by important I mean like commons and uncommons that I think are actually a pretty big part of the format, like Unable to Scream. I talked last week about how I think I got the overall picture of the format fairly accurate, but there are some cards that I was pretty wrong about. Unable to Scream is the first of those. Let's just look at another blue one that is way better than I gave it credit for, and that is Fear of Isolation. So, gave it a C- in the set review. I saw that there is upside in returning stuff to your hand, but I thought that it was going to feel like a downside often enough to really counteract the fact that it's a 2-mana 2/3 flyer with the enchantment type. I was wrong. I don't want to say automatic because that's an exaggeration, but it's pretty close to automatic that you get some sort of value out of this. It has a 59.8% win rate. That makes it like a solid B, I think. I think it's one of the most important uncommons in the set. So you can use it just to rebuy an Eerie trigger, and it triggers Eerie itself too, so you kind of get 2 Eerie triggers out of it. The nastiest thing to do with it, though, is to return one of your rooms, especially if you've only unlocked one room. I mean, sometimes if it's in the late game, you can return it and then unlock both sides, but like the 3-mana room that stuns a creature, like returning that and then recasting it is really great. You can still, of course, rebuy creatures with ETB abilities. This format just has enough fodder for Fear of Isolation to use to be a 2-mana 2/3 flyer with upside in most situations. I mean, it's still pretty awkward if it's your only 2-drop, but, that's a price you're willing to pay because it generates so much value and gives you a really real body. So Fear of Isolation is one of the better uncommons in the set, definitely not a C-. All right, so let's take a break from blue for a minute, and instead, let's take a look at Shrewd Storyteller and Baseball Bat. So, overall, and it's true in most of my set reviews, I am more likely to underrate a card than overrate it. That's not true about these two, which I don't think is that surprising. I think, you're going to be right more often than you're wrong when you give Signpost uncommons good grades or expect them to be good in a limited format. When that ends up not panning out is when the color pair as a whole is just bad. And that is how green-white has panned out overall. At the very least, you don't really play a green-white deck that's actually that interested in doing stuff with survival. Overall, I think the survival creatures were too understated, and this has led to them not surviving that often, even with enablers like Baseball Bat and stuff like that. So it's not impossible, and it's not an unplayable color pair, but when you have 2 Signpost uncommons that are collectively the 4th and 5th lowest win rate uncommons in the set, that's not good. And they are 50.5% for the Storyteller and 50.9% for the Baseball Bat. And it looked like, you could build a nice aggressive deck that includes both of these cards where you are able to trigger survival and sort of snowball from there, thanks to the counters from something like Shrewd Storyteller. But overall, the survival mechanic, most formats have a mechanic that doesn't really hit the way you want it to in terms of being a consistent archetype, and that's what survival is. I mean, the best green-white decks are basically like Eerie enchantment-style decks, not decks trying to do survival nonsense, because the cards that enable and pay you off for doing it aren't good enough overall. So, yeah, these two cards really reflect the fact that green-white, and especially trying to make it into a survival deck, really hasn't worked out. All right, let's look now at a rare. I have 1 rare and 1 mythic on this, and that's because I both think they deserve to be talked about because they're like 2 of the best cards in the set, and I did not quite evaluate them that way. I did think both would be good, but they're both great. So the first of those is Dissection Tools. Give it a B+ in the set review, which is a pretty good grade. I made the comparison to Batterskull in the set review, and, it's isn't as good as Batterskull for the most part because Batterskull could bounce itself and stuff like that. The thing that really kept me from thinking it was as good as Batterskull overall was the equip cost. But there's one really obvious thing that I didn't pick up on, and that is, I knew that this makes a creature, but somehow the equip cost being sacrifice a creature and this being able to equip other stuff didn't really come into play when I was thinking about this card, but frequently, like if you need to get Dissection Tools online right away, the turn you play it, you can equip it by sacking the thing you make and attack with your best creature, gain a bunch of life, right? And that's kind of the emergency version of Dissection Tools, but it's there, and it does work pretty effectively. And even just having a 5-mana 4/4 lifelink Death Touch with a bunch of upside is good. But the main thing that pushes it into being really good is just that it's easier to equip than I expected overall. Like I said, I underrate cards more than I overrate them. Sometimes I'm a bit pessimistic. Sometimes I imagine the worst case scenario. I think I'm pretty good at not imagining best case scenarios when I evaluate cards in Limited, and not weighing them that much. That's why I don't overrate cards very often. But I'm not so good at avoiding like what the downside of a card is sometimes. And I think that's what happened with dissection tools. I thought it would be too hard to equip. I thought of it as more of a downside than an upside, that you don't have to pay mana to equip it. And I'd say it's ended up being more of an upside. Like, not having to spend mana to move this powerful equipment around is a big deal, and you usually have stuff to sacrifice. So this card's one of the biggest bombs in the set. It's an A+, so it's like a full letter grade better than I expected it to be, because it's way easier to equip, way easier to get going, and it's just like an inherently powerful card to begin with. The situation I envisioned where you don't have extra creatures, so how are you going to equip it? I don't know if I've ever seen it happen in this format, and I've seen this card like 15 or 20 times at this point. All right, now let's look at the card that has surprised me probably the most of any card on this list. It's not that exciting of one, but I think it's been a big surprise, and that is Glimmerlight. So I gave this a C in the set review. That's like a pretty solid grade for an equipment. I liked that it gives you a body up front. It's reasonable to equip. It's an artifact, and Delirium likes that. The Delirium decks are into that. The enchantment token will trigger Eerie. Like, these are all things I noted in the set review, and none of that has ended up being wrong. It's just ended up being even more effective and even better in a wider variety of decks than I expected. I mean, this thing has a 58.1% win rate, which is 0.2% higher than Unable to Scream, just to reference another card we've already looked at. It is more like a C+ level card, and it's even close to a B- in the right deck. Like, this card, if I was going to be wrong on this card, I was like, I'm probably overrating it. But that's just not true. The fact that it sets up Delirium well, the equip cost is so low, gives you a body up front, all of this has really, really been important. And kind of like with Unable to Scream, just having a cheap way to trigger cards with Eerie, like once you have 1 or 2 or 3 Eerie triggers in play, all of these cards basically just come with ETBs that are very relevant, like they really, really end up mattering. So overall, Glimmerlight's been really good. I mean, I think you play the first copy in virtually any deck in the format, and in decks with lots of Eerie, you want it even more. It's also pretty good. There are a lot of creatures in the format that carry equipment well. The 2/1 Double Striker, for example, that's printed as a 4/3, but usually has counters on it. Equipping that is nasty. Putting it on the 3/3 that gains lifelink when you trigger Eerie is nasty, and that's a little combo right here if you have the mana to equip it right away. So, it just ends up doing way, way more than just being a 2-mana 1/1 that also makes an equipment, which is something I liked a reasonable amount, and I do really think it's pretty close to a B- level card in this format. Let's look now at Ethereal Armor. So I liked this a fair bit in the set review. I gave it a build around C+, which, if you end up in a deck with enough enchantments, like blue-white, it's going to be really good. You put it on anything, and that thing becomes a massive threat. But it's been even better than that. It's put up a 58.9% win rate, and I would guess that that's actually being pulled down some by people playing it in decks they shouldn't. Like, you can't really play it if you have, 5 enchantments. You've got to go all out, but it's not that hard, especially in blue-white and sometimes in green-white, to just have 10 enchantments in your deck. And if you're doing that, you pay 1 mana, put Ethereal Armor on something, it's now the biggest threat on the board. Also happens to trigger Eerie for a single mana, like Unable to Scream. And if your creature has a keyword ability, once again, the Double Striker, for example, the Lifelinkers in the set, then it gets even better. And, obviously the armor gives first strike. So, it's already very difficult to block. But when you mix in other keyword abilities, which are relatively plentiful in this format, it gets even crazier. It's still not a card I would say, I'm going to first pick it. But, if my first 2 or 3 picks are white cards, especially that are enchantments or whatever, I'm probably going to think about taking Ethereal Armor with my 4th pick. It's just been that good at drastically upgrading your board state for a single mana. It does have the downside that all auras have, of course, that being, you can end up getting 2 for 1. But most of the time, in my experience playing with or against this card, you end up getting enough value the turn you play it that even if your opponent untaps and kills the thing you put it on, it's usually not a disaster. It still doesn't feel good, but frequently you gain life, or you get in for a big hit, or they had to block with something, and then they kill your thing. And you end up breaking even at worst in most scenarios, and if they don't kill the thing you put it on, it's usually just game over. Now let's look at Clockwork Percussionist. So I gave this a solid C in the set review. I was reasonably impressed with the card, especially for a 1-drop, 1-mana, 1/1 haste, dies, you exile the top card, and you can play it until the end of your next turn. That seemed pretty nice to me. But I did kind of think it was really only going to be worthwhile, or I shouldn't say worthwhile, but really only going to be at its best in a black-red sacrifice deck. And that sort of kept me from thinking it was going to be great. But it turns out it is. I mean, it has a 58.3% win rate. It has the second highest win rate of any common in the set. So it's definitely not the C that I gave it. And things I noted in the set review that have contributed to its good win rate: helps you get Delirium, obviously. Sometimes you can set up a 2-for-1, things like that. But, just being like a red-white aggro deck that doesn't care very much about Delirium, this is still a good card. Like, you can continue to attack with it for a lot of the game, especially because red has 2 really good tricks in Jump Scare and the +3/+0/1 that gives you a manifest when the creature dies. Like, you have those things ready to go. You can just keep swinging with it for most of the game. And then the trick ends up even being more efficient because you get a card back from the Percussionist. Also, don't hate manifesting the Percussionist. I've done that a few times at this point in the format. And your opponent not knowing that you're going to get a full card worth of value definitely matters when you turn it face up for 1 red mana on a chump block, or if they block it or something. Like, that has felt reasonably good. And it's just a good rate. I mean, it doesn't always net you a 2-for-1. It's hard for a 1/1 to do that, but it gets closer than I expected it to. Then when you mix in the Delirium value and stuff like that, you end up with a really, really good common. One that you can take pretty highly because it just ends up doing a lot of work. Not a bad place to stick your Ethereal Armor either. All right, let's look now at Final Vengeance. So I gave this a build-around grade. I said it was going to be a D in a lot of black decks in the format, but I have a ceiling of a C+ for, like, the black-red deck. Because, that's often how the Bone Splinters-like effect plays out. It's just an okay to... Well, it's mostly a bad removal spell in most decks, but if you've got a lot of sacrifice fodder, it ends up being pretty good. Final Vengeance does a couple of things that make it better than normal, and it's worth noting that black as a color kind of struggles in this format, so this 56.5% win rate is even more impressive when you factor that in. It's actually the 5th highest win rate of any black card in the set, of any rarity. So that tells you something. So it's obviously not really a build-around card, and I think it's panned out that way. For one of the things that makes it better is that it exiles in a format where that really matters. I mean, there are a lot of really annoying, even at lower rarities, but at higher rarities, you have all the enduring things. You have Balustrade Worm. Like, having answers to these cards that are kind of unbeatable if you don't exile them is pretty nice. But turning off death triggers, preventing Delirium from happening, all that matters too. That, I think, is probably a smaller factor, though, than is the fact that every black deck in the format has fodder for this. Whether you are sacrificing your 1/1 rat and getting a 2/2 back, or you're sacrificing an enchantment, a room that you fully unlocked that already did the things it's going to do. Like, you end up spending 1 mana on this and exiling a creature. I mean, it's not quite Swords to Plowshares, obviously, but, like, there are games where it plays out that way, because it's sort of like how Swords gains your opponent life, but who cares? You're kind of like, I had to sacrifice a creature or an enchantment, but who cares? I did what I needed to do, got their creature out of the way for 1 mana, and sacrificed something meaningless, or even got value back for it. So Final Vengeance ends up being a really good card. You want one in, like, every black deck, and it does get better. Like, it's more like it's just like a solid C or in most black decks in the format, and still like a build around. Like, if you have really good fodder, it gets up to B- level. All right, let's look now at another. This one's a mythic rare. Dollmaker's Shop Porcelain Gallery. So this is a door. I give it a B in the set review. I thought it'd be pretty good. but it has a 64% win rate, which is the 7th highest win rate of any card in the set. So, yeah, in other words, it should have been on the top 10 bomb list, and it wasn't even on my honorable mentions. So, what didn't I like here? Well, this is another case where, like Dissection Tools, I think I put too much weight on the worst case scenario. And to me, that was, you have to attack to get the token. And I thought that would mean that you need to be ahead, or this card's not amazing, right? Because you can't always attack, or so I thought. But it turns out it's pretty easy in this format to have decent attacks, even especially in the early game. But if you have flyers, it gets a lot easier. If you have tricks to back things up, it gets easier. If you have trades that you don't mind making, it gets easier. Like, all of these things make it pretty easy for you to get that 1-1. And then another thing I didn't put enough weight on is sometimes you just draw this late and you just play it as Porcelain Gallery and the game's over. Like, you know, in my head, I was sort of thinking, you play this early, get some tokens, that makes Porcelain Gallery better later, but like, sometimes you just have 5 creatures in play, and you play Porcelain Gallery, and you have lethal. Like, and when I say sometimes, I mean that happens a lot if you draw it late. So, the Porcelain Gallery side has more consistent upside than I expected to see, and the Dollmaker's Shop upside is easier to trigger than I expected. And both of these things have made it one of the biggest bombs in the set. It's another A+ level card that I give a B to, like Dissection Tools. It's even worse here because at least I gave Dissection Tools a B+, but just a solid B here. But this is a card you first pick every time you see it, and it pulls you into the color easily. Like, you know, you're usually just going to windmill slam the card, even if it's like pack 2, pick 1, and you have a few cards in another color. Probably going to abandon that color so that you can play Dollmaker's Shop, Porcelain Gallery. And then the last card I want to look at is Sheltered by Ghosts. So this card I liked a reasonable amount in the set review. Give it a B-. I thought it was a really good aura that would give you nice removal. And I liked that the ward was in the mix because that meant you could like play it early and run away with the game. And then even in the late game, sometimes it costs too much mana still for your opponent to kill your creature. And even if they do, they have to pay enough extra mana that it often doesn't feel like a disaster. But it's way better than I expected. It has a 62.4% win rate, giving it the highest win rate of any uncommon in the set, and having a win rate comparable to some of the strongest cards in the set. And one thing, I mean, I put a little bit of weight on it, but not enough, is the +1/+0 and lifelink often makes a pretty big difference. Putting this on a flyer or other evasive creature, or even just a creature that is able to get in the turn you play it because you exiled their blocker, like, the life you gain from the lifelink on this often is enough to further offset the downside of potentially getting 2-for-1 later. And that's where I really went wrong with this card is, again, I envisioned the worst case scenario where my opponent can still pay like 4 or 5 mana and kill my creature. And that does happen sometimes, but as I've just discussed, oftentimes you've already gotten enough value out of it by the time that happens, and you make them spend enough mana to kill your creature that it doesn't feel like you lost a bunch of tempo. You kind of feel like you broke even in the end. And there are lots and lots and lots of games where Sheltered by Ghosts just completely runs away with it. You just put it on something evasive on like turn 3, exile their only creature, smash in with everything, and there's like no chance your opponent removes it for at least a few more turns. And if it's an evasive creature of some kind, like, the game's just going to be out of reach, even if they do ever kill your creature. So I actually think Sheltered by Ghosts is a bomb. It's not like an A+ like Dissection Tools and Dollmaker's Shop have turned out to be, but it's like an A-. You know, you do need a creature in play, obviously, to make it work. But it's pretty good when you're behind. It's pretty good when you're at parity or ahead. It's just a very, very, very strong card. The lifelink means more than I expected, and the worst case scenario happens a lot less often than I expected. All right, so those are 10 cards I was wrong about in the set review, why I was wrong about them, how they're actually performing in the set. Most of them are better than I expected them to be. Next week, we'll start to dive into the data a little bit more, and we'll start to talk about cards that are being overvalued or undervalued by drafters based on the data. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including draft videos of this format, me talking about this format and other formats, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.